So today we have the pleasure of having Jonas and Rosa. It's relatively newcomer to Umass, but not that new anymore. If you see all the things that he has done, he's been here, you won't believe that he has been here for such a few amount of years. Okay, so he's talking to us today on racializing language, regimenting Latinidad, Latinos, and imagine American ethno-linguistic futures. Jonathan is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology here at Umass, Amherst. He holds affiliations with the Language, Literacy, and Cultural Concentration in the School of Education, as well as the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies. He also is the founder and director of the Cultural and Linguistic Anthropology Digital Laboratory. Jonathan received his MA and PhD from the Department of Anthropology at the University of Chicago and his BA in Linguistics and Educational Studies from Swarthmore College. His research analyzes the joint creation of linguistic and ethno-racial categories with a particular emphasis of language ideologies and practices associated with U.S. Latinos. He has recently completed a book titled...
Oh, the title?
Mm-hmm.
Looking like a... For once, I don't have the same title. It's Looking Like a Language, Sounding Like a Race, Exclusion and Ingenuity in the Making of Latino Identity. There's a colon in there, too, and a comma.
So Jonathan says, my work theorizes the connaturalization of language and race as a way of apprehending modes of societal exclusion and inclusion across institutional domains. Specifically, I analyze the interplay between linguistic discrimination, racial marginalization, and educational inequities in urban contexts. I collaborate with local communities to track these phenomena and develop tools for understanding and eradicating the forms of disparity to which they correspond. My community-based approach to research, teaching, and service reflects a vision of scholarship as a platform for imagining and enacting more just societies. In addition to his scholarly commitments, Jonathan is an ongoing participant in public anthropology projects focused on media representations of immigration, language, race, and U.S. Latinos past. He has been interviewed and appeared on different national outlets such as MSNBC, the Huffington Post, and others. So,
thank you. We have more chairs. I think there are people who pass this back.
There's a chair up there.
We have two. I like it like this, it's cozy.
Lydia, take pictures with your cell phone again about how we need a bigger room.
Yeah, that's true. I'm gonna do that.
It's been like this the last several months. One with windows, preferably. This is nothing but an expanded hallway. Passes as a room. It's the best we can do.
Oh, you know, if the fire marshals happen to come here.
Standing room only from here on.
I'm glad I brought the photos.
One more.
Okay, I think you might as well get started. Thank you all for coming today. This is a presentation of kind of some theoretical developments that I've been working on and some new research that I have in mind. So this is sort of a prelude to my next fieldwork project. I've sort of exhausted the previous work that I've done in Chicago, but I'll show you a little bit of that work as well to give you a sense of some of the work that I'm starting to begin to do here locally. And so much of what I've been thinking about lately is the way that language is recruited to act as a sign of place and of legitimacy in place, and the particular ways that language practices allow us to understand what a population should be and where it should be. So I wanted to also link these ideas of place to notions of time and as well, and the notion of or questions around where people can be when, and in the future, in the past, in the present. So these questions of time and place are central to the discussion today. So time, place, population, language. I wanted to give you a few examples using some kind of popular cultural references. I don't know if we should dim the lights so that people can see. There will be a lot of video kinds of things happening. So is this? I don't know which one's strategic. Does that work? Yeah. I like this. Okay. So the 2013 summer 2013 blockbuster film Elysium exemplifies some of these ideas about language, time, and place and population. So it depicts a futuristic 22nd century Los Angeles. It's a predominantly brown Los Angeles, and the film focuses on the relationship between that Los Angeles and a space station cum luxury resort in the sky where the white people have gone. And in the luxury resort in the sky, they speak French, or standardized varieties of French and English, and in Elysium in Los Angeles, they speak Spanish. And this is, again, a supposed 22nd century Los Angeles. In media coverage that came out in conjunction with the release of the film, there were interesting sorts of characterizations of this future. So this is a conversation between Diego Luna and Conan O'Brien about the film.
Okay, so this is, in the future, they're prophesizing in this movie that everybody speaks Spanish.
Well, yeah.
Because that's sort of the way it's going.
Yeah, and it's not going to take so long. So, do you speak Spanish? That's why I asked your producer.
Yes, un poquito, yo hablo español, es importante que nosotros yo creo que la gente, but anyway, I could go on and on, but I don't.
The thing is, if you want to keep your job in this network, you're going to have to learn Spanish. You know, there's like
yes, because the country, it's all changing over,
47 million people speak Spanish today, and we like having sex. So, multiply that for 8 in 10 years. Another 8 in another 10 years?
Sí, es verdad, es verdad. Es verdad.
If only the rest of us liked having sex.
I know.
We'd have a fighting chance.
It's just so much work.
Okay, so there's an interesting contradiction to the picture of the future that Diego Luna represents here in the interview and the one that's represented in the film. So in the interview, if you want to keep your job in the future, you need to speak Spanish. But in the future depicted in the film, if you want to have a job or a livelihood in the future, you better speak English or French and live in the sky. So Spanish is only spoken by highly marginalized populations in this destitute, futuristic Los Angeles. So in one sense, the future is Spanish, and that future is destitute, or that future is prosperous, based on what Luna is claiming here, in terms of what Conan O'Brien, what kind of language learning process Conan O'Brien will have to participate in. And I also want to think about language learning processes as temporal concepts. So ideas about the amount of time or the work that needs to be put in over time in order to achieve some imagined proficiency. The rest of the interview is really funny. I don't have time to play it all, but they engage in this impromptu Spanish language learning class where Diego Luna teaches Conan O'Brien to say "no mames" and "que pedo," and so it's and Conan O'Brien plays along really nicely. But sort of a converse representation. So here, Spanish is the future. In this one, it's a different kind of story.
There's a good chance America will eventually look a lot more like San Antonio. The Texas city has a majority Latino community where English is the language of choice. The mayor of San Antonio, Julian Castro, is young, photogenic, well-educated, and barely speaks Spanish, yet he could be the model for a new kind of Latino leadership. Maria?
So in this case, English is the language of the Latino future, and one's potential or Latino potential for leadership is calculated or estimated in inverse relation to their Spanish language abilities. So by losing Spanish, you become, and gaining English, you become a more viable political candidate. Sort of a contrasting representations is Linda Chavez, who's really worried. This is, remember, George W. Bush's nominee for Secretary of Labor, who's really worried about whether Latinos are even identifying as American based on a poll finding that less than 50% of third-generation Latinos identify first and foremost as American. And she says they need to do more work to identify in these ways. But then she says the findings of the poll aren't so bad in the sense that the majority of Latinos identify as English speakers. So English as a sign of Americanness is in place. But there's some question as to what the future will be in terms of American identity, what role Latinos will play in producing it or transforming it or unraveling it, and how language should be interpreted as a sign of all of these processes. So in so many of these popular media discourses about the future, Latinos play a central role, so that Hispanics in the future of America, so much of the Latino population is discussed, or discourses surrounding Latino populations are based on the future, are projections. So it's never about a present day existence, it's about an imagined future in which Latinos live. And in many ways, these discourses are at times emphatic and make a strong claim as to who Latinos are as a particular distinctive kind of people. In other cases, there are questions about even what kind of identity Hispanic or Latino is, whether it's an ethnic identity, whether it's a racial identity, what race and ethnicity even mean, if there is even such a thing as a Hispanic identity, all of these questions. Or some people even lamenting that this conversation keeps happening over and over. Oh no, more on Hispanic, Latino identity. In many ways, the current discussions surrounding this topic focus on the census and the way that the U.S. Census has constructed these categories, and how it should calculate, whether it should calculate Hispanic/Latino as an ethnic category or a racial category. And the finding that many Latinos, millions of Latinos, identified as some other race is part of the problem here. So if you look at the way the categories are presented in the census, they're separate, and so you can be Hispanic or Latino or Spanish origin, whatever that means, whether it's Spain-oriented or whether that's an imagined, again, linguistic or somehow ethno-linguistic identity. And then you have the racial categories. And for so many millions of people, they don't know how to navigate these kinds of questions. So that, for example, you could say have a PhD in anthropology and study these questions very carefully and still be vexed by them every time you are presented with them when you are asked to fill out any kind of demographic questionnaire. What do you do? So this becomes an ongoing conundrum. And in many cases, there are these discussions about Latinos not being a race. So sometimes there are these emphatic claims that Latinos are an ethnicity, not a race. Latinos can be any race is the claim. And so questions about Afro-Latinos, or whether Afro-Latinos are marginalized. Questions about whether Latinos are Native American, whether Latinos are Asian, whether Latinos are white, whether Latinos are identifying increasingly as white, or whether they're the new Italians, or some people say, no, they're not Italian. This kind of question around whether this category is an ethnic category or a racial category. What's always interesting to me about these kinds of debates is the way that the suggestion that Latino is not a racial category is based on these sorts of stereotypes about phenotype. And so it invokes the notion that all white people do look the same, all African American people do look the same, all Asian people look the same, all Native American people look the same, and somehow Latinos have a corner on the market in terms of heterogeneity or phenotypic heterogeneity. So to be clear, Latinos are not different from other groups in terms of being phenotypically heterogeneous, and yet there's this suggestion that that's what distinguishes Latinos from other groups. So this question of whether you can be racialized regardless of your phenotype is an ongoing kind of debate. Often language enters into the discussion of who Latinos are. So because of all these questions around whether Latinos are like previous waves of immigrant groups or existing racial groups, there's all of this ambiguity around those sorts of questions, so language ends up being recruited to act as a sign of who Latinos really are. So this question around whether English or Spanish will be the sound of the Latino future, sometimes it's English, and claims about whether Latinos will speak Spanish, whether Spanish will decline in the US, or some claim, says scholar in one headline, US will be the biggest Spanish-speaking country by 2050, okay? In many cases, these debates are about Spanish in general and English in general, so these kind of conglomerate language practices, undifferentiated language practices. In other situations, there are really micro kind of fine-grained, there's attention to minute features of the Spanish language. or the English language. So for example, the AP publicly announcing that it won't use what it calls accent marks in AP copy, so they'll call El Nino, because computers can't recognize those kinds of marks. And then you have many Latino political organizations who are upset about this and create hashtag movements around respect the Enye, time to respect the Enye again. They're upset about, more recently, the actress Elizabeth Peña passing away, and the LA Times announcing it in its headline like this, Elizabeth Pena. And of course, people point out that pena is a different word in Spanish from peña, so pena means sorrow, right? So that the LA Times should be sorrowful for doing this. And in other cases, much more kind of lighthearted discussions, people have pointed out the consequences of using accent marks or tildes, this kind of thing. So Will Ferrell tweeted famously, "Mi papá tiene 47 años. My dad is 47 years old. Mi papá tiene 47 años. My potato has 47 assholes." So not using an accent and a tilde can actually have powerful consequences. So in some situations about accent marks and tildes, so minute features of language, right? In other situations, it's pronunciation, other kinds of pronunciation patterns. Such as when Sonia Sotomayor was nominated for the Supreme Court by Barack Obama, there's this debate over whether her name should be pronounced Sotomayor, like Niedermeyer, or whether it should be Sotomayor, as Barack Obama initially pronounced it. And this question of whether it is natural or unnatural to place syllable stress on the final syllable in English or the penultimate syllable in English. And this idea that saying Sotomayor with the final syllable stress is unnatural. But in many cases, these kinds of ideas also invoke, again, futures and pasts. So the idea of what language practices belong in what time period and are associated with which populations. So this question over whether you should distinguish between Latina, Latino, and whether, why should we do that since English dropped gender nouns 1,000 years ago? So that having gender in language is understood to be an unmodern kind of linguistic structure. So that time and space, so it's an American, a US-based thing, that's a past associated with the English language. And in the contemporary American context, we don't do those kinds of things, regardless of who these immigrant populations are. You can see, unlike my correspondent's simple preference for a monophthong over a diphthong, and insisting on an unnatural pronunciation is something we shouldn't be giving into. You know, any linguistic anthropologist or linguist gets really excited when words like monophthong and diphthong are in random blog posts. Syllable stress becomes the name of the game or something like that. But in many ways, what we see is that these features of language, these categories of language, are being associated with models of personhood, so that there's a clear sense of the model, the image of what the English language is and what the Spanish language is. And it's associated with a certain time, space, and set of social practices. In this case, economic practices, so that race, class, and gender become intertwined in this advertisement for an English language learning and Spanish language learning text. So the idea is the image of a stereotypical, you can't see it that well because of the lighting, but a stereotypical white boss, presumably wearing a shirt and tie and a hard hat, needs to learn Spanish, and a stereotypical Latino employee needs to learn English. So this is the trajectory of language learning that needs to take place for both of them, and these are the economic roles that are associated and racial roles that are associated, or racial kind of mode of embodiment that's associated with these language practices, okay? And this is a dynamic that I refer to as looking like a language, sounding like a race, as a co-naturalization of linguistic and racial categories. So much of how I've been thinking about these issues is informed by a couple of theoretical concepts, which, we won't dwell on these things too much, but just to put it out there, one of which is the notion of chronotope. I don't know if we can see that well on the side, but I'll kind of describe what this chronotope idea is all about. In terms of framings, so chrono as in time and tope as in space. So it's a space-time construction that's involved in any kind of narrative construction or narrative notion. So a narrative about a population is always framed, as Bakhtin argues, and contemporary linguistic anthropologists have reinvigorated this sort of notion. Any kind of framing of a population is always structured by ideas about time and space. What is that population's temporality, and where does it belong? population is just one way of thinking about chronotope. That happens to be interesting for me. So I build on this idea of chronotope by thinking about some of these popular representations of pasts, presents, and futures, and whether Latinos are ever made present or only imagined as having legitimacy in some fictive future. And I also connect this to one other kind of theoretical concept, which is the notion of social tense, which Elizabeth Povinelli, I see Christopher in the back of the room, this is one of his things too. Elizabeth Povinelli has theorized recently, which is a way of it's a grammatical metaphor for thinking about the ways that narrated and narrative events are structured in relation to one another. So for Povinelli, she's thinking about, anytime we're discussing tense, it's a time-oriented conversation. So when did an event take place? But what Povinelli suggests is that our current political and economic moment is structured by a social tense in which imagined futures legitimate contemporary practices. So what she calls a future anterior structures a present durative. Now let me say what that means. So a situation in the future will have made what we are doing now necessary. So in other words, I'm interested in the ways that populations, entire populations, particularly racialized populations, are positioned as expendable, disposable, detainable, deportable, based on some imagined future in which this will have been necessary. So the present durative, what we must do with these people now, whether it's, again, incarcerating them, importing them, or murdering them, it will have been necessary based on an imagined future that is constructed around these populations. And what that kind of a political and economic kind of figuration does is link a set of characters, whether it's the terrorist, the criminal, the illegal immigrant. They become positioned in strikingly similar ways, again, as expendable, disposable, deportable, murderable, these kinds of things. So how does language figure into these chronotopes and social tenses? And how is it that infusing these concepts with a theorization of race ends up helping us to understand how Latinos are being positioned contemporarily? So let's look at a few chronotopic figurations.
Papa, why do we have a hybrid?
For your future.
Why?
It's better for the air, and we spend less because it runs on gas and electrical power. Mira aquí. It uses both.
Like you with English and Spanish.
See?
Then why did you learn English?
For your future.
Coming soon, the all-new 2007 Camry, also available with hybrid synergy drive from Toyota, the power to move forward.
So the commercial's a little creepy and robotic, actually. If you look at it, there's sort of a weird feeling to it, an AI kind of feeling to it. But what's interesting is, again, the invocation around, or in this case, the metaphor around language and fuel technology. So the idea is that the father, as a bilingual English-Spanish speaker, is like a hybrid fuel technology. The father is like the car. He's a hybrid, which means the son, as someone who is presumably English dominant, he's closer to the future, which is a renewable fuel technology, which invokes the notion that a gas guzzler, a non-renewable technology, a linguistic gas guzzler, would be a Spanish speaker, or a dominant, Spanish dominant person, or Spanish monolingual. So Spanish is the non-renewable linguistic fuel. Father's like a hybrid, he's on his way there. And the son, as this embodiment of language shift, is the idea of an ideal future. There are more kind of explicitly derogatory presentations of this, such as Newt Gingrich's comments in the run-up to the 2008, when he was running for the Republican nomination in the 2008 presidential election.
We should replace bilingual education with immersion in English, so people learn the common language of the country, and so they learn the language of prosperity, not the language of living in a ghetto.
So in this case, again, think about time, place, and what prosperity is as a particular kind of temporal concept as well. When prosperity did happen, whether it's happening now, this is in the context of a recession, and how we would get to prosperity in some future, and the ways that ghettos are associated with that in particular populations. Note that Newt Gingrich has publicly kind of denounced his comments and now has a Spanish language tutor. So he's embraced a different chronotope. educational contexts are rife with these sorts of framings.
The most news in the morning. CNN's American Morning. Weekday, 6 a.m. Eastern.
Some people are saying that teachers like me should not be teaching students who are learning English.
Some teachers like Christina Parsons in Tucson believe they're being targeted by the Arizona Department of Education because they have accents.
A state monitor came into your class.
Yes.
They audited you.
Yes. They just walked in the middle of class.
Parsons, who was born in Brazil, has taught ELL, English language learners, for more than 20 years. She has 2 university degrees. This is the first time she's been audited, and she resents the extra scrutiny.
You could have a PhD and be a bad teacher.
State School Superintendent Tom Horn says as part of No Child Left Behind, he's been monitoring ELL teachers for bad grammar and mispronounced words for the past 8 years.
Are you going after one particular accent?
We're not going after any accents, including Spanish accents. It has to be faulty English. If students are being taught English and they're going to refer to a comma as a coma, people are going to misunderstand them.
English professor Roseanne Gonzalez disagrees, saying studies actually show that non-native speakers make better English teachers.
Are you saying that a teacher's pronunciation of specific words is not important?
That's right, because language is very contextual. We depend on the context to understand what words mean.
You would tell somebody who could not be understood that they need to go into another profession.
Of the 1,500 teachers who were monitored last year, 25 were found to have pronunciation issues. That worries teachers Charles Collingwood from Trinidad and Ian Kidd from Ireland, who wonder who's judging.
You can't say there's one way to pronounce anything in America.
See what kids are learning. Those are more important thing than if I say think instead of take.
Horn's critics say he's going after immigrant teachers.
It's totally idiotic. I grew up in a house where my parents spoke Polish, and they certainly spoke English with a heavy accent.
But here you are, superintendent.
Right.
So it didn't hurt you.
No, but my teachers spoke proficient English.
Christina Parsons says she's also proficient.
The Arizona Department of Education gives a certificate saying, yes, you are certified to teach. After that, they say, no, I don't think you can do it, so I'm going to go into the classroom and see if you're doing a good job. Let's go.
Parsons is still awaiting results of her audit. If she doesn't pass, she could be reassigned to another position somewhere else in the district. Thelma Gutierrez, CNN, Tucson.
So Arizona has been ground zero for a lot of these policies around language, immigration, ethnic studies, in terms of eradicating ethnic studies programs, instituting the Papers, Please law, SB 1070. Many of these policies which have since been thrown out in federal courts. But what I want to take note of here is the way that accent, and think back to the slide with the debate over the Enye, whether you should pronounce Peña as Peña or write Peña as Peña or as Pena. The ways that minute features of language are recruited to operate as signs of identity, as signs of immigrant otherness, or as signs of legitimate Americanness. In this case, the policing of accents represents the need to be able to recognize people as, again, legitimate Americans or not. In terms of this broader discussion of temporality, of time and space, or of chronotopes, as I've suggested before, immigration ends up being a really fascinating example. Note again the constant framing around the contemporary immigration debate in terms of questions of whether we should open a pathway to citizenship. It's always a deferred access to rights. So a pathway to citizenship, note, is a temporal deferral. You never become a citizen, you never fully access rights. It's in some future when you will legitimately be entitled to those rights. So in a lot of my previous work, I've looked at how these issues work in or operate in the city of Chicago, and the questions of whether Latinos in Chicago have created a Spanish bubble around themselves, and whether they're cutting themselves off and thereby reproducing their own marginalization, or responsible for their own marginalization.
There are pockets of Chicago where people can buy their ice cream on the corner, shop for groceries, pick up their prescriptions, attend church,
por nuestro Señor Jesucristo tu Hijo,
essentially live their lives without ever speaking a lick of English.
And you're supposed to say dum dum dum. Oh my God, they speak Spanish. They're gonna be okay.
I like the idea of a lick of English.
They don't speak a lick of English, right? The tongue has to be involved. So this is the positive framing.
The next generations of Chicago Latinos, including those who just graduated from the Hispanic Metropolitan Leadership Institute, are breaking out of the Spanish bubble with encouragement from folks like their commencement speaker.
In Chicago, all of us respect the past. We live in the present, but there's always vision in the future. And if you don't have it, that's when your city fails, that's when everybody else fails.
He says that's when your family fails, that's when you fail. That's the infamous Mayor Richard Daley. In this case, you see, again, a very clear chronotopic framing around past, a present, and a future, and the way that the Spanish and English languages are associated with those past, presents, and futures. And in my previous research, I've shown how this involves a complete misrecognition of how many Latinos actually identify themselves in relation to a city space like Chicago, and in relation to languages such as English and Spanish. So on the one hand, the overarching question of whether people are Latino is rejected by people who embrace subgroup identities in the first place, either as specifically Mexican or Puerto Rican. These are pictures of demonstrations in Chicago where you see the Mexican flags and Puerto Rican flags. Very clear senses that being just Hispanic or being just Latino is not the point in the first place. And also clear ideas about pan-ethnicity, the idea that Mexicans and Puerto Ricans have some shared positioning, some shared relationality, and this is a famous immigration, or a famous chant that people would use during immigration marches, Boricua y Mexicano luchando mano a mano. So Puerto Rican and Mexican fighting hand in hand. No, Puerto Ricans are born citizens of the United States, not by choice, but by imposition, but yet have taken up the immigration or participated in many immigration demonstrations, so that the leading congressional voice for immigration reform, Luis Gutierrez, is a Puerto Rican from this neighborhood in Chicago that was just represented in that media, the news story, and that's represented here. And so what I show is the ways that Chicago Latinos, particularly Mexicans and Puerto Ricans specifically, create alternative imaginaries around space and around identity. So specifically, they create powerful diasporic imaginaries, where this is a monument that's of the Puerto Rican flag in Chicago. There are two of them. They stretch 59 feet in the air and 56 feet across the street. They're the largest monuments to any flag in the world. And many Chicago Latinos will get tattoos, or they'll get it cut into their hair like this, as the Puerto Rican flags. And you see the Chicago skyline, the Puerto Rican flag. It says City of Wind and Yo soy de aquí. The question is, where is aquí? Is aquí here or there? Is it the island, or is it Chicago, or is Puerto Rico in Chicago, or Chicago in Puerto Rico? This is a Mexican flag that is etched into a Nike Air Force One shoe. It's green, white, and red, and you can't see here because, again, the lighting, but the Chicago skyline is in the shoe. So it's not just about being Mexican or Puerto Rican, it's about being Mexican and Puerto Rican in Chicago. So the idea is a claim to place in a very specific way that rejects these homogenizing views of Americanness that we've seen from Newt Gingrich and some of the others. Again, just a few more of these diasporic representations. This one is an advertisement by a particular neighborhood in Chicago that is understood to be the center of Mexican Chicago. Dine in Little Village, to Mexico to Chicago, with accent marks on to, weirdly, but don't worry about it. The home of authentic Mexican cuisine. In this case, overuse of accents. They reject the Associated Press, check it out. But the idea is that Mexico and Chicago get laminated on each other. This one's really interesting. It's the state of Illinois with a Mexican flag, and then Little Village. So it's a particular neighborhood in Chicago, within the state of Illinois, that's painted as Mexico. So it's not about being one or the other, Mexican or American, but being US-oriented Mexican and Chicago-oriented Mexican. This one is really fabulous. So this is a grocery store in the Puerto Rican neighborhood between those giant flags. It's called La Municipal, and it has its storefront facade is in the image of the oldest Spanish fort in Old San Juan. If you've been to Old San Juan before, you might recognize El Morro here. And so this is supposed to invoke the image of Old San Juan in Chicago. But then you have an artist, a Chicago-based Puerto Rican artist, who paints an image of El Morro. So this is actually Old San Juan, and he puts La Municipal in Old San Juan with the Chicago-based storefront facade. So here it's Puerto Rico is in Chicago. Here it's Puerto Rico is in Chicago is in Puerto Rico. So it's multiple degrees of lamination around these identities. And I think my absolute favorite one is this flag, which is called 79th. There are 78 municipalities on the island of Puerto Rico. This has officially been adopted as the 79th municipal flag of Puerto Rico, and it's in Humboldt Park in Chicago. So that Chicago is understood to be a part of Puerto Rico. So that these ideas around time, or particularly around space and identity, and whether one is assimilating or one is maintaining an identity, in particular ways are contested by the embrace of these sorts of diasporic identifications. And they do really funny things with language around this as well. So these laminations of Puerto Rico and Mexico in Chicago are dynamically mediated by laminations of the Spanish and English languages. So probably my favorite example is a trick that some of the students would play on their teacher, where if they had a monolingual English-speaking teacher, they would say, "Teacher, how do you pronounce this?" Particularly Mexican students did this, and the teacher would say pink cheese gringos culeros, which is pinche gringos culeros, or fucking assholes. But they would only do this with teachers who they loved, who they felt they really trusted. But in this case, it's a way of signaling legitimacy with respect to the English and Spanish languages, in the same way that those diasporic imaginaries are ways of embracing different alternative modes of legitimacy with respect to the U.S. and Mexico and Puerto Rico, respectively, across generations. So in the last kind of portion of the talk today, I wanted to show how I'm thinking through all of this previous research in relation to my new work in Holyoke, Massachusetts. So Holyoke is has the highest concentration of Puerto Ricans anywhere in the mainland United States, 44.7% Puerto Rican in Holyoke. Its demographic, and note Springfield is in the top 10 as well with 33% Puerto Rican. Its demographics are often represented in highly stigmatizing ways, so usually around its medium income, which is much lower than the state overall, poverty rates, and eligibility for free or reduced lunch. And so you see this alignment between the percentage of people who are Latino or specifically Puerto Rican here in Holyoke. This is Holyoke. This is South Holyoke. And images of income, right? So there's this alignment between one's economic position and the concentration of Latinos or specifically Puerto Ricans as a way of representing or mapping populations, okay? Holyoke also becomes notorious for having the 4th highest rate of Latino suspensions in the United States. Hartford wins it out, though. And this ends up being associated with the school-to-prison pipeline. So these are the ways that Holyoke is often mapped in terms of its educational underachievement. So if you see here gateway cities in Massachusetts, former sort of post-industrial cities throughout Massachusetts. Holyoke has the highest percentage of students who score below proficient on the MCAS. So 87%, by far the highest, in fact. This is the gateway city average. This is the Massachusetts average. And when people try to make sense of why it is that there are these dramatically underperforming schools and dramatic forms of disparity experienced in Holyoke, language is often recruited to answer that question. So in a recent Mass Live article that was celebrating improving graduation rates, you see here Holyoke again was among the lowest in the state despite a high school graduation rate that improved slightly to 53.8% from the previous year's 52.8%. The city of 40,000 is roughly half Hispanic. Among challenges, officials have said, is that English is not the first language for more than 70% of public school students. So the problem, the reason why there are all of these economic issues and educational issues is the Spanish language. That's the justification or the rationalization. It's not rampant inequality or rampant there's no question around redistributing resources in any kind of way. It's a linguistic issue. And yet, when the current mayor of Holyoke, young Alex Morse, who at the time was 22 when he was running for mayor in 2011, when he was engaging in his election campaign, suddenly the Spanish language was very valuable for him. So Alex Morse counts fluency in Spanish, while incumbent Alain Pluta, his opponent, cites experience. So Alex Morse became aligned with the future in relation to his Spanish language proficiency, so that when contextualized in relation to Alex Morse's whiteness and class privilege, he had just graduated from Brown University, the Spanish language becomes a sign of the future. When it's oriented in relation to Latinos, as we saw in the Chicago example, the Spanish language is a sign of the past. So in terms of normative whiteness, Spanish engages in this chronotopic inversion. It's no longer past, it's future. And all of his campaign materials were in Spanish and English. And when he was elected, there were all these references to his language abilities.
Morse, just 22 years old, the youngest mayor in the city of Holyoke's history. He graduated from Holyoke High School in 2007, then went on to Brown University and got his degree in urban studies. Morse is bilingual and thanked his supporters in Spanish during his acceptance speech.
My favorite part is they always mention Spanish, but they never tell you what he says or play him speaking Spanish. It's the idea of Spanish in relation to this figure. So it's a conception of language that's more central than actual language use.
We know there is a huge Latino population in Holyoke. Correct me if I'm wrong, you do speak Spanish.
I speak Spanish, yes.
How important do you think that is going to be?
I think it's important. I think it's important that we have a mayor that can communicate with those folks in Holyoke who do not speak English. And yes, while it's important that everyone does speak English, it also is important that we have a mayor that can communicate with folks, because you connect with people on a much deeper level. When I would door knock in the flats or South Holyoke, with Spanish speakers, we can connect and have a conversation about the issues. And that's incredibly important to me, that I can communicate with my voters and my constituents.
So my point is not that it's bad that Alex Morse speaks Spanish. He speaks Dominican Spanish. No, he learned his Spanish, I think, at the Peace Corps when he was in undergrad. It's great that he speaks Spanish, and even Caribbean Spanish in a Caribbean Spanish-speaking context. But the point is that the same language practices which are stigmatized and framed as the cause of underachievement and economic despair in Holyoke are understood to be a valuable resource for Alex Morse. So part of what I'm thinking about in terms of Holyoke is how it is that we could remap the city of Holyoke. I mean, you have a vibrant bilingual community where monolingual, again in scare quotes, monolingual teachers, school administrators and policymakers, they lament the the alleged linguistic incapacities of bilingual students and families and community members. So you have all kinds of students and community members who, from some perspectives, have linguistic repertoires that are larger than those of their teachers, and yet who are understood to be suffering from these linguistic shortcomings based on monolingual, monoglossic, monolectal sorts of ideologies. So just as an image of what these monolingual, monolectal, monoglossic ideologies look like, the idea that you can map out the world and that entire regions of the world are associated with one language entirely. This is a monolingual kind of ideology, so the entirety of the US and Canada are English. The entirety, you have Chinese and Spanish and Arabic, etc., mapped on, again, Chinese as a language, right? Which is a monolingual ideology around geography and populations. You have, in the US, commonly monolectal ideology. So even if we recognize that there are different ways of speaking English, we still imagine entire regions of the nation to be associated with one way of speaking language. So you ask people whether they say soda pop Coke or soft drink, and then you understand that entire swatch of the nation to be associated with one way of using language. Yet anyone who has ever lived anywhere on planet Earth knows that no one uses language the same. No two people use language in precisely the same ways. So our ways of mapping and imagining place, populations, and language practices are really short-sighted. Even when we attempt to recognize linguistic difference, it still works from a monoglossic ideology that imagines Spanish speakers and English speakers, say, as separate people. So even when we recognize that in the US we don't only speak English, there's no way of representing the linguistic dexterity or the bilingualism that's associated with people's everyday language practices. So moving forward in my future research, I'm trying to think about ways of remapping linguistic diversity, so thinking about place and populations and ways that people can be made present, that is, have claims to rights and resources in the present moment, not just in some imagined future. So taking a communicative repertoire approach to people's language practices that in fact embraces the range of ways that they talk and text and understand and read and write and use language across modalities. by using a sociolinguistic justice approach that really frames language use or works alongside community members to define their own language use, that doesn't simply take for granted the boundaries around languages or the ideas about proficiency that are often stereotypically used to stigmatize, or stereotypes about proficiency that are used to stigmatize populations. And also, the newer thing that I'm working on is getting GIS training to really remap, find ways of dynamically, visually representing people's linguistic and cultural practices across contexts. Keeping track of the ways that people make sense of the language practices of their families and in various community contexts, and finding ways to represent those dynamically using digital mapping techniques. So I'm going to be quiet now. That's it.